Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Luke Hunt and this is another podcast for The Diplomat, and with me is Margaret Bywater, who has spent many a decade in Cambodia and has decided to call it a day and head back to Australia. In Cambodia, she's extremely prominent for her work in refugee camps, in bringing education to the country when it was a failed state, and in particular establishing libraries.
Mostly establishing libraries and training librarians and teaching researchers how to use, first of all, how to use journals, but then when we got the internet,
it changed everything.
How to use journal databases.
And on that note, Margaret, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Take us back to the 1980s, Vietnamese occupation, 4 major warring factions, although they'd splintered, and
yes.
The country was a failed state, and you arrived in the middle of it all.
Well, can I start a little bit before that? Because I didn't actually come here cold. I'd had a long interest in Southeast Asia, going back to primary school years, when one of the speakers we had, who was the mother of one of the first Australian volunteers to go to Indonesia. Mm-hmm. And this fascinated me. And then when I was in high school, at University High School in Melbourne, some of the first Colombo Plan students were my fellow high school students. So
the Colombo Plan was basically a scholarship program that was established by the Australian government.
That's right.
Only 5 years ago, perhaps, it was reintroduced.
Yes, well, it started in the middle 50s, and later on I actually did some work with AVI staff when it was called Overseas Service Bureau. Everything changes its name over time. So
they reinvent themselves.
Yeah. So through libraries, I also, I read profusely about Southeast Asia, and I remember meeting Bruce Petty, mm-hmm. who did a wonderful sketchbook of Southeast Asia and a tour he made around in the region, in sometime in the early 60s.
Okay. So this was your inspiration.
So all this, yes, and a lot more too. And so I was working at the State Library part-time and working for Quaker's aid program part-time. And we began to receive requests from American Quaker Service, AFSC, to assist them providing funds for work they wanted to do in the emergency period in Cambodia and later on after from 79 onwards.
Right, once the Khmer Rouge had been ousted by the Vietnamese.
Yes, because the American government was prohibited Australia and allies, American organisations were not allowed to use their own funds.
Sure, and
because of the Trading with the Enemy Act.
Indeed, and Cambodia had been basically saved by the Vietnamese, but they were the wrong stripes given American losses during the Vietnam War.
Yeah, that's right.
How did you find Cambodia?
You see...
I know how you found Cambodia, probably on a map, but once you landed...
And for a number of years, I was reading reports and helping write proposals and reading everything I possibly could to get a picture of what the situation was in the country. I also knew quite a little bit about Vietnam because I'd worked on projects during the war, actually. There was a Quaker group that ran play therapy sessions in orphanages in Saigon, and they also worked in the north as well. So Quakers don't...
You weren't confined to Cambodia?
No. So, but that was earlier. And I also have Vietnamese relatives by marriage. So a lot of interest in the region. So how did I find it when I first got here? Well, because I'd been working with American Friends Service Committee, I had a really good background on what they were trying to do, and they were trying to work with prosthetics.
Yep.
Because there were so many amputees. They were working with the Ministry of Health, and they were working with education, trying to help rebuild the education system. And that's where Quaker Service Australia came into the picture, because we had a track record of assisting projects through the Americans and had visited. I was at an annual aid conference in Canberra in 1984, and an officer came up to me and said, would the Quakers be interested in implementing an English language teaching program in Cambodia? Well, in Kampuchea was what they said. And I said, well, I can't speak for the organisation, but so you'll have to ask us. And this was all part of Bill Hayden's approach, where because Australia was unable to implement a bilateral program, they then used NGOs to do some of the same work.
Right.
And that became the foundation of the aid program over latter years.
Okay, and Bill Hayden was the foreign minister at the
Bill
time?
Hayden was the foreign minister at the time. And
with
later on, after the 93 elections, Bill Hayden was Governor General by then. And he was one of the first non-Eastern European heads of state to visit Cambodia.
Okay. Now, how difficult was Cambodia as a country to work in back then?
How difficult? Well, there were the logistic problems like electricity and water, and there was a curfew at night from 9 o'clock at night till 5 or 5:30 in the morning. There was only one flight a day. One flight a week from Bangkok, and it went from Bangkok to Saigon. So that was with Air France, and then, and earlier still, it was a Red Cross flight. Then you came from Saigon to Phnom Penh, so it took the best part of a day to get here once a week, and going out the same. And that was because the Thais would not allow anyone going, Cambodian Airlines, to fly in Thai airspace.
It was a different time. In those days, commercial airlines had to fly around Cambodia.
That's right.
Because it was a civil war.
That's right. Yeah, it was. But I mean, this was an actual restriction on the Kampuchea. Air Kampuchea we flew from Saigon back to Phnom Penh with Air Kampuchea, and they were old Russian Illusions.
I remember those planes.
Yes. Made a terrible racket, but they got you there.
Sure, they did. I remember a few trips where my confidence in getting to the destination wasn't always great.
Well, if you were going from here, you went down to Saigon, and you had to, and they used the airport that had been built by the Americans, but it had been built with air conditioning, and there was no air conditioning. So it was a very, very hot and uncomfortable wait. And the Air France staff would take pity on us, both in Bangkok and in Saigon, and we could upgrade it. So if you were lucky, you came back. If you're coming from Bangkok, you came back with a little bottle of French wine.
Very nice.
And having either travelled in first class or business, because there were not many passengers.
Sure.
But I'm talking about 86, 87, 88. Yeah.
How did you find the Cambodians? Were they welcoming? Did
They
you
were
struggle?
very... Well, Cambodians were still recovering, and they were still very poor, and they were, BKK, Bang King Kong, one of the, it used to be very exclusive.
Suburb
It's not,
of Phnom
yeah.
Penh,
Now it's not quite so. It's all commercial now,
Mm.
but the houses there were sort of thatch and bamboo and the stumps from old houses.
Yep.
So, some people had come back and were able to move into their own homes, but when people came back in 1979, if they were working for a particular ministry, then they were allocated housing around the ministry. So there were lots of Ministry of Education people living around the ministry, which was down Norodom, what we now know as Norodom, and Ministry of Interior or up on the other side of town. That was because nobody had any transport. So if you had to go to work, you had to walk or ride a bicycle if you were lucky enough to have a bicycle.
Sure, and the cyclos would take
that's
half
right.
an hour to go 500 metres. The roads were so bad.
Yeah, well, the cyclos were all employed by the Ministry of Interior, and so they would line up outside what is now the Royal, and we knew it as the Samaki, and they would tell you when there was when a flight had come in, when there were Australians on the flight. They knew before we did who was coming in. So yeah, a lot of, if we wanted to go to visit any of our projects, we had to make application to the Foreign Ministry, and if the security was okay, then we would normally be able to go. But if there had been fighting or there was anxiety in a particular region, we'd have to wait. So very few people went to Battambang until quite into the late 80s. And you couldn't go to Kompong Tom because you could not drive to Siem Reap.
No, we're talking about the central and western provinces.
Yes, that's right. Sorry.
That's all right. But there was a lot of fighting in those areas, and there were many people stuck in refugee camps.
Yes.
And you were personally dealing with them.
Yes. Well, I didn't actually visit any of the Thai refugee camps, but I was able to visit. In 1989, I visited a refugee camp in Hong Kong. And the refugees there were some Cambodians, but they were mostly Vietnamese. And they were whole family living in a little
Cage houses.
cyclone wire cage.
Hong Kong was notorious.
And I felt really quite disturbed by that. It was, I don't know how long people were kept in those places. I'd also, I forget when, sometime in that period in the 80s, visited Malaysian camps, and they were all managed very well, I thought. And I know that Australian immigration would go to those camps and interview people, because my brother worked for a number of years out of the High Commission in KL. So it was through some of his contacts that I think that I actually went to visit there. But in some ways, people in camps, although they were constricted, they didn't have to worry about where the food came from, and a lot of them were very fortunate to be able to learn English and learn trade skills and things. So that difference carried on between people who didn't run to the border and people who settled on the border. That caused a lot of tension, even within families.
there's also the prospect that they might get out of those camps and head for a third country like Australia, the United States, Canada.
Yes. Well, that was yes. But I always thought that one of the problems was that because a lot of the West provided food and the Thais were making money out of it, encouraged people to go to the border. So, but it's all politics. It was all the Cold War being... Anyway, I don't want to talk about the politics of it because...
the politics is what has dominated.
Yes. And I think it was the Cold War that made the whole situation of the settlement and the eventual peace process drag out for a long, long time.
It was many years.
Many years.
Before they, even with the Paris Peace Accords in Cambodia, the arrival of UNTAC in 92 and 93.
End of 91.
Right.
UNIMEC.
UNIMEC came first, then UNTAC.
Yeah, I was here, so I remember all that.
Well, aware you were here. And the war continued until 1998.
Yes, I know. It was, and lives were still being lost. And,
were you confronted by the war very much? Did you?
In the early 90s, I do remember waking up in the morning, and early morning, 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and you could hear artillery out in Kompong Spur. But you didn't see a lot of military in the same way that you go to somewhere like the Philippines. I was in the Philippines for several months in 89, and the military, until UNTAC, you didn't see a lot of military, but because they were in the border areas.
Sure, and the fighting was border areas with Vietnam to a point, but most of it was up in along the Thai border particularly. What do you think have been the greatest achievements that Quakers, Australians, yourself can put your hand on your heart and hold your head up high?
I haven't worked... I've worked from time to time with the Quakers, but I'm very aware of all the work that they're doing. And the Quakers are only one of... When I first came, there were about 100 people working for NGOs.
Right. That's not a
and
lot,
of course,
as opposed to what would come later on.
Yes, well, and some... maybe 100 is... There were 5 NGOs, so maybe 100 is more later on.
Well, as a comparison, I think it was the 2002 telephone book had 52 pages of NGOs in it.
Yes, that's right. Yes, yeah. Well, there was American Friends Service Committee, World Vision, SIDSE, which is a Catholic consortium from Europe, Oxfam. And then later on, other Oxfams. There was, later in the 80s, the Australian NGO Office, which was Freedom from Hunger.
Right, that's okay.
Overseas Service Program. Yes,
that's fine.
Yeah. So from a very small base, the NGO program grew. In the early days, because there were no Western embassies here, the only non-East Bloc embassy that I can remember was the Indian embassy.
So you were very much on your own.
Yes, but also the Cambodian, I don't know what word to use.
When you want it.
The government authorities.
People know what you mean.
The government authorities were very keen to include NGOs and there would be maybe 1 or 2 foreigners in each office. That
relationship would change 20 years later.
Well, it did change later. But the people that I knew and worked with back then still remember me, still greet me very, very warmly. So it was a different kind of atmosphere because we were, in effect, representing the West. And so it was beholden upon us to keep certain standards.
Sure.
Yes. So that changed with UNTAC.
It did indeed. The country was awash with money. There were plenty of young people.
But it was an amazing time to be here because you could see how hard people were working to try and make up for the past.
This is one of my arguments that back in those days, and we'll keep the politics out for a little while, but the West did have a conscience. There were many people in the West who did have a conscience about what had happened in this country. It had been left out, abandoned, and subjected to a civil war.
Yes.
Which was horrific. A third
Well,
of the
they were
population
punished because Vietnam. Yes, I thought that very much that they were punished, and I think there's a lesson for today from that, and that it's so important to keep the channels open with Myanmar on both sides. The representatives of the government that was elected and the representatives of the military. Much harder to negotiate with the military. Much, much harder. So when you think about Myanmar, when you think about Sudan and other places where these kinds of conflicts go on for years and years, and the people who suffer are the ordinary people. The military, well, they lose their lives, but
Some of them.
Some of them
profit.
Well, indeed. Well, we saw that here too. So, I mean, as a Quaker, and even before I became a Quaker, I've been a lifelong pacifist. I grew up during the... I remember the end of... I was only just over 3 when the Second World War ended, and my father was a pacifist, and so you imbibe those kinds of values about that war. And what's that quote about war begins in the minds of men, and so the way to solve it is using the minds of, I forget.
That's close, yeah.
Yes.
A lot of people say war is the byproduct of failed diplomacy.
Yes. Well, of course. And the other one about the first casualty in any war is truth. And that's...
Yep.
Yeah. And if we look at the First War and the Second War, one of those... Well, the First War was the war to end all wars. And certainly it only... Yeah.
Then it became World War I and World War II, which was...
So, I mean, I like to think that I'm an optimist, and I like to think that we're getting better at this, but I sometimes wonder.
Well, when one looks at the Russia and Ukraine,
but,
the re-establishment of the junta in Myanmar, it's and the way authoritarian regimes have taken hold over the last 5, perhaps even 10 years. It's not always a cause for hope.
It's so interesting when one is here and people criticise how things are done. A number of years ago, when I was working with Asia Foundation, I met an American who'd been the deputy representative back in the 60s and 70s. And he told us that in his office, he had a little signboard with his name on it. And on the side where the visitors were, there was his name. And on the side facing him, it said, "Remember, it's not your country."
This is true.
It's very true.
And
so anyone who comes here is very privileged to live here. And I really think we learn more from the Cambodians than we're able to.
Well, that was one of the issues that I found earlier on, and I arrived much later than you, is that so much of Cambodian culture had been obliterated. Now,
Yeah.
I don't know why, but I remember around 10 years ago, women stopped using
Oh, yes.
the bowing with the
Well,
cupped
you still
hands.
do it, but it's
Not
much...
like they used to. And then
Yes.
I remember also around about the same time, people were remarking that Khmer women are singing again. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? And I was like, well, Khmer women were famed for kind of working in the kitchen or working in the fields and breaking out and singing.
Yes,
And that had been lost for 3-4 decades.
yes,
And
yes.
it kind of rolled back into the culture. It was just something we weren't aware of.
Well, there are a lot of changes like that. I think the greeting like this is still very important. And it's like in Afghanistan, it's
Hand on the
yes.
chest.
Cambodian parents do teach their small children
To bow,
yes.
hands clasped.
But the influence of television and social media and means that some of the traditional values, some of the traditional ways of doing things are changing. Back in the 80s, they worked very hard at making sure, reviving dance.
Sure, had the apsaras and
Yes. And I remember very clearly being invited to, and how proud Cambodians were, being invited to the very first performance of the shadow puppets in the old Mahasrop, which burnt down in 1994. So people were very proud because in order to perform with the puppets, they had to restore them and they had to find people with the skills who could do that. So I felt very privileged to be in the audience when that first performance took place. So, and that was part of, because we were a small community, we were invited to, whereas perhaps nowadays it would only be, prominent people.
Well, that has become the way. What was, do you think was the worst moment of your time in Cambodia?
Well, the grenade attack.
In 1990?
I can tell you exactly, on the 30th of March 1997.
Mm-hmm.
And because it happened almost outside our front gate, because I lived with a local family and we lived next door, almost next door to the National Assembly. So that was, there weren't emergency services and people were injured.
They were badly injured. There were
Yes.
a lot of people were
Yes.
hurt very badly that day and killed.
We had been out, we came home, we had been out for noodles, we came home. And there was a wedding just up the road, and there was somebody speaking on a soapbox. And so I thought, oh, I'm not leaving the car in the street. I drove the car in.
There's
and
a
went
political
inside.
rally by Sam Rainsy.
Yes.
Who was the
And went
opposition
inside
leader.
and went to change into, more informal clothes. And bang, 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 bang. And because I live with a local family, I called everyone in, and so did the head of household. And I thought, right, 2 internal walls away from outside, and they slammed all the shutters and locked everything. And we had no idea. We could hear the screams. We had no idea what had happened. And I think it happened about, sometimes about 8:30 or something in the morning. And it was after 10 o'clock in the morning before I managed to listen to Radio Australia news. It must have been at 10 o'clock, to find out what had happened right outside where I was living.
It was a horrific attack.
It was a grenade.
Responsible
Yes,
is still the subject of speculation.
Yes. Well, once we knew what it was, and it was it didn't solve anything, but I mean, I think people thought, it's the Khmer Rouge back or something like that. I felt my role was to be with the family and just be because it was no good me being afraid. Because
Indeed.
I was afraid, but once I knew what it was and we were able to tell people what had happened, we just stayed inside all day.
I think once you're exposed to those sorts of situations, and fear is a very real issue to deal with, but you have to deal with it, you have to manage it, and you have to get on with it.
That's right, yes. And you think about the people around you and the effect on them. Yeah.
So, Margaret, you're heading back to Australia. You're a sprightly 80-year-old.
I hope so.
With a marvellous future if you play your cards right. What are you planning on doing?
Well, I'm going back to spend more time with my husband instead of making one or two visits, sometimes 3 visits in the year. So we haven't seen each other since before COVID. I want to re-establish my vegetable garden. I've got a number of tasks that I'll be involved with Quakers in publications and in an embroidery project where we're creating panels that depict the history of Quakers. So I'm going to be involved in that. I've sung in choirs here. The choir that I was a founding member of in Hobart. It's changed its name, but it's still operating 40 years later.
Rebranding again.
So I'm going to go. I hope they'll have me back.
I'm sure they will.
I think singing is a wonderful way of spreading warmth and happiness among people.
That's a lovely thought. Margaret Bywater, best of luck. Thank you very much for the last 35, 40 years, thereabouts.
Thank you, Luke. It's been a pleasure to share some of this with you, and I wish you all the best in...
We'll carry on.
Keep the flag flying here.
Shall do. Margaret Bywater, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.